Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 20, Section 2, World War II Begins. And to start with, I've got a few little things I want to talk about as far as what kind of leads Germany into this war. And the first couple slides that I'm going to show you, you're not going to need to take notes on, but Hitler became the leader of Germany in 1933 when he was basically elected chancellor, became chancellor of Germany. And in those years, since he'd been elected, Hitler obviously was telling the world that he was very upset with the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. And by 1935, he acts on his defiance. And he does two things that are in obviously direct violation of the treaty, basically saying that this treaty is no longer basically relevant. And he does first, which is to begin building or rebuilding the German Air Force, known as the Luftwaffe. This idea that when World War I ended, the Germans were basically forced to demilitarize and they had to get rid of their Air Force. Well, if Hitler's going to be able to do everything he's hoping to do, he's going to need a powerful Air Force to get that done. And so they start amping up production of aircraft and such. To make sure that there's people in those aircrafts, he does the next thing, and that is passing the military service law, which basically begins conscription or draft of men. And as a result of the Treaty of Versailles and that demilitarization, the German military after World War I basically was kind of relegated to a police force. And by having a draft of 500,000 men, you're going to amplify that. You're going to bring up those numbers, and you're going to send a very strong message to the world that you need to be taken seriously. Okay, European leaders, for the most part, really didn't want to have to deal with Hitler all that much, and so they chose to negotiate with him. And so my question is, why did they do this? And there's a few obvious reasons. One, most leaders of Europe didn't want to repeat World War I. They hated that bloodshed. It killed a lot of people. There was not a nation that certainly wasn't impacted in some way or another by that war. And they wanted to avoid that at all costs, the war to end all wars. Another reason was that some of Hitler's demands kind of seemed somewhat reasonable. Hitler wanted to reunify all of his German-speaking regions within Europe that they had lost as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. And some leaders of Europe thought that that was all right. Okay. And finally, a lot of people assumed that the Germans were really more interested in peace than actually gaining territory. And that could be the furthest thing from the truth. Obviously, Hitler was very interested in building his empire and regaining lost territories as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. So, for the most part, people probably weren't really thinking about, what the real motives were here. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's happening in Austria. And number one here, Hitler sent troops into Austria in March of 1938 and announced what is known as the Anschluss, or the unification, if I can remove this, there we go, of Austria and Germany. This goes back about a year into 1937 when Hitler called for this unification, or the Anschluss. And what he wanted to do was, basically get the support of the people living in Austria. You got to remember, Hitler is an Austrian. And to eventually get Nazis into the Austrian government. One of the things that obviously the leaders of Austria were concerned about is that this wasn't very democratic. They wanted to have elections to see whether or not the people of Austria freely wanted to become unified with Germany. And they had planned for an election roughly at the end of February, beginning of March of 1938. But Hitler sent troops into Austria ahead of that. And what ends up happening is we have literally a very peaceful reunification, this peaceful invasion. And for the most part, the Austrians, they welcomed Hitler with open arms. The elections never took place, and Germany and Austria were unified as a result of that. Uh, this kind of leads to some other events because Hitler's going to be demanding more territory. And one of the areas that he was really interested in was a place called the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland, you got to look at Czechoslovakia. There's this map here. There's a little dotted line that kind of goes around the western border of Czechoslovakia. That is the Sudetenland. Okay, there is a very large German-speaking population here, but also this was once part of Prussia or part of Germany and was given away as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, and Hitler wanted it back. So there was talk in 1938 that Hitler was willing to do anything for this land. Many of the Czech leaders resisted these demands. Matter of fact, they kind of pleaded to some of the other nations of Europe, and France threatened to fight Germany if they would attack Czechoslovakia. And the Soviet Union, they promised aid if that would happen to the Czechs. The British, because they're allied with France, if France invaded or tried to fight Germany as a result of an invasion here, Great Britain would back up France. So needless to say, this was kind of sounding like war. Okay, so there is going to be a meeting at a place called Munich, or aka the Munich Conference. And really, the key issue here is this idea of an appeasement. This idea that you're going to try to negotiate and maybe give some concessions in hopes that you're going to have peace. That's really what appeasement's about. The leaders of Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, they all met here. Ironically, not Czechoslovakia here, but they were going to discuss the fate of this nation. And the British and the French were like, oh, we don't want to go to war. We don't have to do this. Let's give Hitler a little bit of something. And so Great Britain and France agreed to Hitler's demand to take back the Sudetenland. And what France and Great Britain asked for in exchange was peace. Okay, so that we could avoid this from happening. So at the Munich conference, Czechoslovakia's leaders were informed that they must give up the Sudetenland or fight Germany on their own. Okay, if they give that land up, then Germany would leave them alone and there wouldn't be any problems and we'd have peace. What I think is interesting is Neville Chamberlain, who was our Prime Minister of Great Britain at this time. He goes back home after the Munich conference and he kind of gives this quote. My good friends, for the second time in our history, the British Prime Minister has returned from Germany bringing peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our time. Go home and get a nice quiet sleep. And this was in late September 1938. What's interesting is I don't think Neville Chamberlain really trusted Adolf Hitler at this point in time, and Hitler really didn't have any love for Neville Chamberlain. He thought that he was kind of a wimp. But Chamberlain went back to Great Britain, and they went ahead and they started amping up rearmament. Okay, which was probably a good idea because by March of 1939, Germany had sent troops into the rest of Czechoslovakia, had divided the nation for the most part. Those people who were on the western side of Czechoslovakia, they became part of Germany. On the east side became Slovakia, which was an independent nation. And needless to say, Hitler got what he wanted. Okay, and not only that, but there's going to be other things that Hitler's going to want. The city of Danzig, which is right up here on this map, this is something that Hitler wanted in October of 1938. He wanted the city because it was 90% German, and it wasn't very far from East Prussia, which was part of Germany. What he really wanted was direct access, meaning railways and highways that would allow for the German people to kind of come and go into this region. And needless to say, this demand convinced Great Britain that war was inevitable. Okay, and this is March of 1939 that this is all going down. And Great Britain basically made a pledge that if Poland was invaded to get Danzig, that Great Britain, the most part, would come to the aid and defense of the Polish people. And not only would the British do that, but the French would too, because again, they're allies. Poland, for the most part, refused to give up Danzig. And, Hitler obviously was upset. He ordered his army to start preparing for war, but at the same time, remember, this is spring of 1939, he ordered his foreign minister to negotiate with the Soviet Union. And what ends up happening is they come up with an agreement, and we're going to talk about that here in just a moment. But Hitler's demands of Poland convinced Britain and France that war was inevitable. This is in March of 1939, or May of 1939. Joseph Stalin, who was our premier or leader of the Soviet Union, he believed the best way to protect the USSR was to have capitalistic nations turn against each other. And as a result of that, he was willing to negotiate with Adolf Hitler. And what he come up with is what is known as the Nazi-Soviet Pact, or AKA the Non-Aggression Pact. This was going to be signed in August of 1939, and it was a pact that basically said that Germany and the Soviet Union didn't want to fight one another. Okay, but secretly, the key provision here, which was not necessarily made clear to the rest of the world until after the fact, was that if Germany invaded Poland, the Soviet Union would come in and invade the eastern part of Poland, and the two nations would divide Poland in half, Germany taking the west half, the Soviet Union getting the east half, and there would be no more Poland. Okay, but it also meant that Germany and the Soviet Union wouldn't go to war with one another. Hitler's going to get basically an opportunity to concentrate on fighting the French and the British. And the Soviet Union, for the most part, they're going to get some peace and a little bit of land. So in on September 1st, World War II begins, and the Germans are going to use a new type of warfare known as the Blitzkrieg, which basically is kind of a mechanized war. It's moving fast, using mechanization like aircraft, like bombing campaign bombers, tanks, or any other kind of motorized vehicle to swiftly move into territory and occupy it, which worked out really well because the Polish army, for the most part, was still using horses and moving around ancient cannons pulled by horses. So certainly the Nazis had a huge advantage when you talk about the technology. Anyway, Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. By October, Germany had defeated Poland's military. It basically kind of goes like this. Germany comes in quick. They fight. The city of Warsaw, which is the capital, basically surrenders to Germany on the 27th of September, 1939. And by October 5th, just a week or so later, Germany pretty much has defeated the entire Polish army. Okay. Yay for the Germans. They quickly are able to get the stuff done, but at the same time, that means that we're at war, because literally Great Britain and France declared war on Germany 2 days after the initial invasion. And so the question is, now what happens? And what ends up happening is basically from October to the spring of 1940, we have this period known as the Phony War, where we're all at war, but we're not really fighting anything. And what's happening is we've got a period of rearmament that's going to be happening primarily for the Germans. So, talking about rearmament and fortification as a way to kind of be prepared for future wars, the French, right after World War I, started building a line of concrete bunkers and fortifications known as the Maginot Line, with the heaviest part of the defense being literally right on the border between France and Germany. What's interesting is the Germans knew about this, and kind of like with World War I, they obviously decide not to go that direct route from Germany into France. They bypass that by invading France via other nations. And that leads us to number 9. Germany started attacking the Netherlands in May of 1940. Belgium, which is a neighbor of France, and Luxembourg. And what ends up happening is the troops that the French and the British put in these regions are easily overtaken by the speed and the force of the German army. And what ends up happening is many of them are getting pushed back to the coast. And what ends up happening is a little coastal area known as Dunkirk, which is in the northern part of France, right along the Belgian border, is the last port that the Nazis haven't taken over. And it is estimated that somewhere around 38 or 338,000 British and French troops were saved as a result of an evacuation here at Dunkirk. What's interesting is the Germans were really kind of on a roll. They were literally within, a position where they could actually have taken over the British and the French army, what was left of that. And what's interesting is Hitler pulls back his troops when they could have really issued that final crushing blow. And some people kind of wonder why Hitler did that. He was on the verge of winning this whole thing. And I think some people have believed that he was fearful of losing his tanks and didn't want to necessarily risk that. And so for about 3 days, the Germans kind of backed off. And as a result, the British government calls upon the military and civilians to take whatever, boats or vessels they have and to go across the English Channel to save these troops. And literally 850 ships, some of them small sailboats, all the way up to military naval ships, come to the aid of these troops. And they evacuate them, and they are rescued by June the 4th of 1940. This becomes known as the Miracle at Dunkirk. And it really was a miracle. And if you want to learn more about that, there's some movies about this whole event. But it's certainly a game changer by all means. Okay. By June 22nd, 1940, for the most part, France has surrendered to Germany. The irony here is when the Germans have the French surrender to them, they use the same railroad card where the Germans had to surrender to the Allies during World War I. So it's kind of like, trying to rectify all the things that happened in the past. Anyway, as a result of this surrender, Germany installs a puppet government. If we can move this here. There we go. Sometimes known as Vichy France. And Marshal Philippe Pétain becomes the figurehead. For the most part, he is basically a collaborator with the Nazis. And for the most part, is in the process of repressing a lot of the French people. And certainly when we talk about the Jewish population, they certainly are going to be not spared whatever the Germans want to do. But Charles de Gaulle, who was a general in the Free French resistance, he questioned the legitimacy of Vichy France. And basically, he called upon the Allies to see those leaders of Vichy France as traitors. And what ends up happening is we have de Gaulle, who for the most part is exiled in Great Britain, who is leading the French resistance from England. Okay, there were many people in France who were fighting the Germans as saboteurs and such during this period of time, and we can thank the leadership of de Gaulle for that. And number 12, Hitler had expected the British to negotiate peace. Certainly after the fall of France, I think Hitler thought that, the British would surrender as well. And Great Britain had actually elected a new prime minister, Winston Churchill. And Churchill was kind of a no-nonsense kind of guy. He refused to negotiate with Hitler after Francis surrendered. And he actually was able to rally his people and call upon the United States for a little bit of assistance. And moving into the fall, late summer, fall of 1940, we have the beginnings of what is known as the Battle of Britain. Hitler had expected the British people to negotiate peace. He had not expected the bravery of the British people. And what I think is interesting is the British, for the most part, they are under the assumption that yes, it's going to happen quick. The Nazis are going to have an all-out invasion of the British Isle, and that doesn't really happen. When Hitler decided to invade Britain, he found that getting across the English Channel was going to be a major challenge, and so he calls upon the Luftwaffe to go in and try to destroy the Royal Air Force. And this whole event in the late summer, beginning of fall of 1940 is known as the Battle of Britain. June of 1940, the Luftwaffe begins attacking ships that are in the English Channel. By August, it's an all-out battle on the Royal Air Force. And the Luftwaffe one night drops bombs accidentally on the city of London, killing civilians. As a result, the British are angry, and so they call upon the Royal Air Force to go out, fly the next night. They drop bombs on the city of Berlin. Okay, a tit for tat kind of thing. Hitler is angered by that, and so he just concentrates on these bombing campaigns of the city of London to terrorize the citizens. And what ends up happening is the Royal Air Force, which was really greatly outnumbered by the German Luftwaffe, is able to prevail. And part of that is because they had one big advantage, and that is the technology of radar. By having this radar, the British, for the most part, they could see when the Luftwaffe was sending in planes. And so they could protect their citizens by, sounding sirens to tell them to go into the bomb shelters, which a lot of them did, like we have here. It allowed for the Royal Air Force to intercept these incoming German aircraft. The British, just so you know, they had pilots that were flying with them that were from Poland. They had some of the Free French resistant pilots that were flying for them, Canadian pilots, and there were a handful of Americans who had chosen to fly for Great Britain. And it's these pilots that saved the nation for the most part. There's a quote here that I want to have you look at. Never was so much owed by so many to so few. This was a quote that Churchill made on October the 12th, 1940. And for the most part, it's because of the Royal Air Force that Hitler canceled the all-out invasion of Great Britain. So, thank you very much.